Our first session this afternoon is going to be on data mapping. We're going to talk about creating a data catalog for your SQL Server estate for this new era of oversight. And I want to talk a little first about what I think that's going to entail, what we're seeing already in our conversations with DBAs, other data professionals who are having to implement new approaches to providing extra information for your SQL Server instances. First of all, a little introduction to about myself. My name is Richard Macaskill. I'm a product manager here at Redgate Software. And I've been working with SQL Server for many years. I've been in the data area for over 20 years now, starting off as, on Oracle, moving to SQL Server in about 2000. And I mainly worked in financial services. I worked as a BI developer, worked in line of business, risk and performance systems. And lastly, I worked in financial services at a particularly interesting time, which I think is relevant to some of the things that we're seeing today in the change of approach, the change of emphasis to adopting a risk management approach to data protection. I worked on SQL Clone and Data Masker, and now look after the data privacy and protection areas at Redgate. So if you want to hear a boring compliance or DevOps story, especially one that kind of aligns the two, come to me. So GDPR hit the news with quite a big bang. For a lot of people, it hit the news in the last few months when it was suddenly turned into an avalanche of emails. A lot of organisations didn't quite seem to know where they stood with GDPR. Although it had been on the statute books actually technically for 2 years, the response was very much, I've got an avalanche of emails and I'm not very happy about it. I'm not sure that avalanche of emails was strictly necessary. We saw this in a gym in London on our way to our SQL Data Privacy Summit that we held in London a few weeks ago. The response to GDPR has been stop sending me all these emails. But the response of data professionals, I think, has to be a bit different. Whether or not those opt-ins and re-opt-ins and we've updated our privacy policy messages were all justified or not, the regulatory changes that we're seeing represent a sea change, an absolute revolution in the way that organisations are being asked to deal with personal data. And it's not just personal data and it's not just the GDPR, it's risk management as a whole around data protection. What the regulators are doing, in my view, is creating the right environment for a completely new approach to be taken and for old and redundant approaches to be discarded, to be beyond the pale, really, beyond any reasonable person's defence. Creating a defensible position for GDPR, for data protection, for protection against the consequences of data breach risk, all kinds of data risk, involves working with your colleagues in ways that are possibly quite unfamiliar to some of us who've worked with data for many years. Fundamentally, I call this a shift into a new era of show me, don't just tell me. I had a little experience of this as I worked in financial services in London from the late 90s. Into and through the period when there was the financial crash, when Lehman's collapsed, and we saw quite a radical shift in the way that organisations placed expectations onto their IT professionals, and especially those who looked after data. So I think we're moving into a situation similar to that, in the sense that your colleagues can't just trust you anymore because there are statutory responsibilities that exist at the board level. The board of your company is now responsible for what happens to data under its control, and that's very clear. Whether or not you're explicitly compliant with GDPR, I think you should be preparing for that kind of shift in the way that your organisation looks at it. So just as pre-Lehman's, I've worked in financial services, as I say, the IT department would be held to account for operations, for operational efficiency. If a service went down, if there was a problem, questions would be asked, perhaps an incident report would have to be written up. But fundamentally, the IT profession was trusted to keep its own domain in order, to look after things like the technical measures that might be difficult to explain, that might be difficult to justify to your colleagues. Database professionals would very commonly invoke, the complexities of load balancing, the complexities of encryption when they're having discussions with colleagues. And I think, although that became less and less acceptable in that post-regulatory era, when we had things like compliance officers mandated for investment management firms. And I think very much the same is going to happen around the data profession, and we ought to get used to it. So your colleagues can't just trust you. They can't just say, I think they're a good guy. I think she's good at her job. She's a good DBA. They have to know what you're doing, because they're not doing their jobs if they don't know. And they also know, if they weren't already aware, thanks to all the GDPR publicity, that penalties are going to be effective and dissuasive. We know that they're being worked on at the moment. I understand there's a lead time of six to 8 weeks for the ICO to bring a prosecution, and we're only a few weeks in after the legislation has become effective. So I think we're going to see that very quickly, and we better get ready for not just the change in what we have to do, but the cultural change that's going to take place as well. So in this new era of show me, don't tell me, you will have to go beyond the basics, I believe. You'll have to keep, according to the legislation, granular records. They must be in writing. The information must be documented in a granular and meaningful way, and it also must be true in the present. Because your information about what you're doing and what you're holding, how you're treating data, how you're processing information, has to inform the decisions. It can't be inaccurate at any point, so you need up-to-date information. You certainly don't have a fire and forget obligation to go and create some documentation and then move on with business as usual. That will certainly not be seen as a mitigating factor in the event of any incident. And once peer scrutiny is out of the bag, once your colleagues have understood that it's their responsibility to understand how your organization is treating data, I don't think it'll go back in again. I don't think those days when the DBA or the IT manager can fob off the questions, can divert with technical detail. I don't think they're going to come back again, and I think we're looking at a very different environment in the near future. One of the aspects is actually very explicit in the GDPR legislation, and as Grant said, and as I'll give some more details in a moment, in upcoming legislation we think we're seeing emerge around the world, there are mandatory templated approaches that you need to take, and capabilities that you need to develop as an organization in order to be fully compliant. So if you don't know how to comply with one of these things, if you haven't done the upfront thinking, if you haven't prepared your organization and prepared your colleagues for what's involved, then that's not going to look very good in the event of an incident that gets investigated. We have things like the data protection impact assessment. The GDPR is very clear that you need to know how to conduct a DPIA. You need to know when you need to conduct one, and you need to do that, and fundamentally you need to do that whenever there is any change that may impact the risks to personal data that you are holding. So if you don't know how to do that, now is the time to practice that, to get on the ICO website. ICO.org.uk is a very good resource. If you're in the UK, I suggest it's probably a decent resource wherever you are in the world for understanding this wave of data regulation, because they've taken some upfront initiatives and put a lot of work into that. Subject access requests are very specific in the very specific obligations that you now hold if you hold personal data, and you need to know how to comply with them. There's been some very interesting incidents recently. If you follow there's some great websites out there about GDPR incidents, GDPR nonsense. Some people misinterpreting it, but also some good examples of companies being so far behind the curve. And customers are starting to pick up on this. They're starting to submit subject access requests. And if you find yourself unable to comply or unclear about what is involved, you won't have very much time to catch up when the first one comes in. So you've got to get ready. So this is process change. This is perhaps a cultural change. This is process change. This is getting familiar with a new era, with some new obligations. And you've got to get ready for it as a DBA. If you've been one of these kind of guardian of the server room kind of DBAs, if you've been one of those IT managers that sort of holds a barrier between you and your organization, you're probably going to have to get ready for change. Not just in those procedural manners, those procedural preparations for complying with legislation, but in communicating with your colleagues. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that new emerging capabilities around the SQL Server data platform are going to help us to comply with those obligations. First of all, just a couple of words. So Grant had a great phrase there, a great metaphor that you can't just put a shell around your production systems anymore. I would say there's another way of looking at that, possibly similar, possibly not quite the same, which is you can't have a moat and drawbridge approach to protecting your organization's data, the data that you look after. Or rather, I say your organization's data. Perhaps you're the curator of that data. Perhaps that's a better metaphor. But the mentality that, well, we've got intrusion protection, we've got a best-of-breed industry firewall, we use the right routers, we check our configuration, we have penetration testing. These things are all really, really good, and you should be doing them, but they're not necessarily enough. The moat and drawbridge approach, where you're protecting the perimeter, but not adding protection, not giving any thought, any risk assessment to what happens inside the perimeter, is also risky, and that needs to be looked at. And one of the reasons it needs to be looked at, of course, is that the caricature of the nefarious hacker with a hoodie that we see on the news when there's a hacking incident, the guy in the darkened room sitting in front of a flickering grey screen does not reflect the reality. Most, if not, many, if not the majority of incidents do not really involve that type of hacking at all, if many do at all. So this is some data that you can see on the screen, prepared by the Attorney General's office in New York State, as part of the preparation for the SHIELD Act, which, as Grant mentioned, has many, many similarities with the GDPR. It also puts the obligation on businesses to protect the rights of the individual. And the rights of the individual obtained from their citizenship, obtained from their rights as a human being or data subject. Now, because they obtain from the individual, they also apply beyond boundaries. So the New York State SHIELD Act is considering that approach. Others, as we've heard in California, in Japan, and in Australia, are adopting this approach. So part of the justification for this is that data breaches are not just hacks. 24% of New York State data breaches in 2016 were the result of inadvertent disclosure. And if you look at some of those other causes, they don't align with the sort of hacker cliches either. And on the IBM ran a 2017 cost of data breach survey in which the majority of incidents were caused by human error or system glitch, misconfiguration, losing a config file. It was not malicious criminals who were the main problem. So if the main problem isn't always outside the perimeter, what do we need to do about that? Well, the law in GDPR terms is very clear. We need to gather information about what we do with personal data, what the purpose is for processing. We need to obtain records of consent, and this is the bit where some confusion has emerged among marketing teams in many companies, I believe, where they believe that you've got to re-obtain consents. If the consent database was well managed originally, they probably didn't need to, according to most industry experts. But you certainly do need to make sure that consent obtained forward from this point is explicitly obtained from people with full knowledge about what you're going to do with their information. And you need to keep records of your processing activities under your responsibility. What's more, you can't just abrogate that responsibility. You can't just farm it out and say, we've got a company that takes care of that. You're responsible for that relationship and for their ability to comply as well. So the law is very clear. We can all go and get some legal advice. We can understand that we need to have new responsibilities. But we also, as data professionals, I think need not only is this law now, if we've not got started in our organisations to disseminate this information, to make sure that we know who we need to speak to, who we need to cooperate with, what kind of work we need to do with our colleagues in order to support our company having that defensible position, having a position where the risk that exists It can't be eliminated, we know that, but if there is an incident, then we are mitigated against the highest level of the consequences. We need to know who to speak to, what we need to do, and for many of us, that we need to take the initiative as data professionals. Many of the DBAs we're speaking to find that the GDPR program in their organization has either circumvented the database management layer altogether, which is particularly surprising in some organizations where the vast bulk of data is in relational databases, or is very slow and very late to translate the needs of the legislation into actions that the data team, the DBA, and the IT manager need to carry out. So the regulators have been doing a good job, I think, of getting this information out there. It's maybe taken a little while for people to start listening, but there are all sorts of resources out there. I mentioned the ICO.org UK website. Elizabeth Denham, the UK's Information Commissioner, has a podcast that you can listen to where it's put very straightforwardly, very simply in plain English. And the emphasis is on the risk assessment, the relevant risk assessment for your organisation. So if we look into some of the details of the GDPR requirements for data professionals, for data controllers, so this is the obligation of the organisation, which in organisations with lots of relational databases is going to come through the data team. Each controller shall maintain a record of processing activities under its responsibility. Okay, so we can understand processing, I think. We can start to draw up records. We can start to sketch maps of what we do with data, how it flows through our organisation, what gets transformed, how it arrives at places, and that's certainly important. But one thing I think is sometimes overlooked is that the processing of personal data very much involves storage. Where you store it, how you store it, what protection you apply through that storage mechanism, what you do when you make copies of databases, what you do when you bring databases into environments which are possibly less protected than other environments. One key point is that it's very easy to obtain budget for your production environments, for possibly adding encryption by upgrading to Enterprise Edition. It's much less so for other environments. And so we're going to look at some of the approaches that you can use to protecting those production environments throughout today, and also through protecting those non-production environments. Steve Jones is going to give you a great demonstration of going into some real detail of how a developer uses a provisioning system which applies some safety. So the processing involves looking after storage. Processing, whenever you see it, is storage, obligatory cat picture. So that's just production. So we get the production systems, we look at where everything is, and we consider whether we're doing the right thing. Well, again, just like perimeter protection, that is very, very important. That is something that you need to do. But most organizations, infrastructure when it comes to databases and applications and services look a little bit more like this. On the right-hand side, you've got the production systems, the lifeblood of the company. This is the thing that pays everyone's wages. This is the thing that keeps operators awake at night, worrying about everything being fully performant. And it is the most important thing. It's critically important. Of course, we should care about it. But what GDPR is telling us, what this new wave of legislation is telling us, what the attack vector of data breaches is telling us, is that we need to care an awful lot more about that left-hand side as well. Most organizations take data into non-production environments, and when they do so, they ought to be applying the same care that they apply to the production data. Perhaps even more care in some ways. The left-hand side is going to be less protected because it's very, very hard to work with databases that have all the production, encryption, load balancing, and availability features on them. It's very hard to ask developers not to work with full ability to turn on and off these features, to implement different changes, to make operational changes. It isn't just code, as Grant said. You're not just chucking code over the wall. You never have been really, but when it involves data as well, I would argue that it's even more the case. that you need to pull your data, you need to work with data in environments that aren't as protected as production, because you need to be able to experiment and try things out. And therefore, as well as exposing it to a greater number of people, you're exposing it to other attack vectors. So we need to take a huge amount of care about those non-production environments, and gradually build up that confidence as we move towards production and deployment. So let's talk about documentation. There's those requirements about describing what you have and where it is, as I say, apply to the production systems and to the non-production systems. So let's go and perform an exercise we could download a trial of some software, create some documentation, put it in a wiki. That looks like a feasible response, possibly. That was the kind of response I think we've seen in the industry over many years. Documentation was an occasional burden. Most of us felt that it wasn't worth the while because it was fire and forget. It's very limited value in creating that static documentation unless you actually expect not to touch your environment, not to perform any change. And if you're not creating any change and you're in an organization with multiple environments, you're possibly in a slightly curious position. You expect your environments to change. You expect your configuration to change on your servers, not least because you need to react to threats. If there is a new capability that comes out of attackers to attack relational databases or the infrastructure that they sit on, you need to be aware of that and you need to respond to it. So it's unlikely that even your server configuration is going to remain the same. There have been cases that in fact the regulators have been very clear that even maintaining a good patch process is part of being compliant and would be part of your mitigation. So being on old unpatched servers is very much a risk that you need to consider in your risk assessment of the way that you look after personal data. Your servers are not going to keep the same configuration, and you're not going to perform there's no refactoring. You're not going to be in a position where the data schema is going to remain absolutely static. Your schema is there to evolve. It's there to reflect the changes in your business. And if you're unable to refactor them to make those changes to reflect business change, then that's something that you should make your business very aware of, because you're constraining their ability to perform new types of operations, to perform new types of revenue earning activities. You need to be able to react to exploits. There's the classic quote as well, of course, is that 30% of maintenance time is spent in consuming and understanding the original product documentation. It's absolutely key to have live and trustworthy documentation. So static documentation probably doesn't cut it. What's the alternative? Well, we're calling it Evergreen record keeping information that's up to date. And DevOps processes help you a great deal with that, knowing about change. Now you can start off with a semi-manual process. If the right people know that a change is taking place, then they can react. You can use tools like DLM dashboard that Redgate has in order to be aware of schema change, in order to make sure that the right people know. You can use release notes, and you can use deployment mechanisms with release gates if that's what suits you. But your record keeping needs to keep up with reality. It needs to be evergreen, and that's going to be a key part of complying with new legislation. You have to be aware of change over time, respond to it. In an ideal world, we'd all like our systems to respond automatically, and we're at Redgate are certainly building towards that capability. But you also need to be able to work with your colleagues. It can't be something that's away in a dusty folder or at a technical level of detail that's inaccessible to your colleagues. You need to be able to communicate it in a straightforward manner. And you need to know when things have changed, especially so that you can be aware of any deviation from best practice, so that you can be aware of anything that isn't quite right. I believe Kathy's going to go into some of the capabilities of SQL Monitor in knowing when deviation from best practice has occurred. Putting your tooling together in a way that supports change over time, that helps you work collaboratively with your colleagues, and that can alert you to change is going to be absolutely key to this new world of evergreen record keeping. So as I say, we need now to say what it is and where it is. We need to know what kind of data that we're holding and where we're holding it. Now, what kind of data we're holding has been something that's quite difficult to document over the years. Most relational database systems have an ability to provide some kind of textual context. People use column names to provide some sort of meaning. Often it's very, very obscure and very difficult to understand. It needs the grey beard, the person who's been there for a long time, who's really got the business knowledge. And that's no longer adequate. The documentation is now, in the ICO's words, has to be in writing. The idea that people claim to have documentation not in writing is quite an interesting one, but they clearly felt the need to spell that out. You need to show where your data is held, and that is all the places that data is held or could be held, what type of data it is, and how you're protecting it. You cannot, I believe, build a defensible position in the context of GDPR, in the context of a data breach epidemic, unless you can do these things. But there are challenges. It's not straightforward. So we can look at providing some extra metadata, some extra information onto those columns that are holding the actual data. We don't have a mechanism for labeling data. So do we label the container of the data? That's the approach that we've taken initially. That's the approach that Microsoft have taken. And I'm going to look at a couple of details of that, of how we've implemented those approaches. I should mention we're talking to Microsoft quite extensively about this, making sure that we don't diverge. So if you go down the Redgate path, there'll be a way back to the Microsoft path and vice versa. We're trying to make these interoperable because it's an emerging thing for all of us. So we've started with the point that we think we need to label the thing that can hold the data because we don't have a mechanism for labeling data itself. But what do we do when the container no longer contains that data? What do we do when we're just working with a schema because we're developing it? What if we have changed the content so that they're no longer sensitive data or they're less sensitive data? And there's a lot of thinking to do about this, about how we swap in and swap out labels. Do we delete the label when the label no longer represents what's in the container? Or does the label describe the intent? I think we're looking at the latter. I blogged recently on this. You can see on the Redgate website. And this is what we've been talking to about. We've been talking to industry experts, we've been talking to Microsoft, and we've been talking to DBAs globally about which kind of approach is really going to work. If we're talking about increasing the amount of metadata, information about information that we're storing, is that a label? At what point does that become a catalog? What point does that become a resource in itself that we need to manage? And what else do we want to put in the catalog? Do we just want to label our production systems and try to make sure they stay labeled? Or do we also want those labels to drive our behaviors, to help our decision making? And then what do we do with things like, what do we do when the label is present, but the information it's describing is no longer present? We can look back at the history of library sciences. We can look at how catalogs have been treated historically. And I think we need to bring some of that to bear on the SQL Server data estate. So we need to make sure that we're talking about everything. If we can't assert that we've looked everywhere where the SQL Server databases may be, then how can we know that we've got everything? How can we know that we've described all the cases, all the ways in which data is used? How can we know that we haven't got stale backups or old backups, unprotected sources of information? How can we know that we haven't got database servers all over the environment? We've speaking to data professionals, I say, of the course, especially of this year. We found it's quite common for DBAs not to know about a database server, which is it's understandable if you know the context they're operating in, but I think it'd be less understandable from a regulator's perspective. You need to know that you have looked in all the places. And what will happen when a new SQL Server instance is created? On third-party databases, we have very specific problems. We've spoken to quite a few people who they know they're responsible for the database, for the data that is in those databases. They know it contains personal data at times, but the vendor isn't really helping them. So they can ask the vendor to update with the right privacy labels. In some cases, it's possible to extend vendor databases. At other times, the support contract is actually constrained or rendered invalid by updating schemas. So we've got to think about how we're going to deal with some of those, I hesitate to say edge cases. These are quite common, and sometimes they make up, you know, a good 20–30% of the estate or more in some organizations. And change, how do we deal with change? Is my schema static? Is the data the same? Am I populating this, this column with the same data? Is it being deprecated or taken out of use, refactored out of the way? How do I change the labels if so? And what do I do with records that don't have labels? So people are turning to data catalogs. We're seeing industry analysts are observing a big upswing in interest in data catalogs. To the extent that Gartner wrote a piece not long ago stating data catalogs are the new black, which take that how you will. But we certainly have heard about an upswing in interest in data catalogs, in going a bit further than doing the absolute basics in managing information about information. There was a great presentation at SQL Bits in London earlier this year, where William Rush of Microsoft was describing the data catalog needing an end, needing a purpose. The data catalogs initiatives historically, which are only serving their own purpose, are much difficult to see through to completion. So data catalogs are the new black, but they're also great. They also need to be for a purpose, and that purpose of data privacy and protection, of supporting the correct implementation, the correct monitoring, and the correct masking strategies, for example, we think is the purpose that is of most interest to data professionals right now. So I'm going to talk for quite a while. I'm going to switch into a couple of demos. You may not be aware of some of the changes that are going on in the SQL Server platform. And I also want to update following that with the slightly different implementation that Redgate are taking, and explain a little bit about the thinking behind that. So if I can switch into my demo here. This may be familiar to some of you. This is the Redgate provisioning system. This is sold as SQL Provision. This part of SQL Provision is the SQL Clone dashboard. So what you're looking at here, these cards, are really DevOps prepared copies of databases. If we look in at some of the detail here, we can see that I've got some small databases that are created on a batch. Here I have a copy of AdventureWorks, which are refreshed nightly. I've got some larger ones. Here's an example of Data Marts, which is over 3 terabytes, and I run clones from that, so I can maintain many clones at a very small disk space. So essentially, we know this is a combination of virtualization, but also now data protection, which supports the correct usage of data in those shift-left environments on the left side of that diagram that we were looking at before. But what we've also brought, so we need to look at how we're going to protect this information, and how we're going to decide on some masking rules. So I'm going to show first of all the Microsoft approach before we go back into that provisioning workflow. So if I look in here, I can see that the SQL Server Management Studio is showing me some databases on a server, and there is a new set of tasks on here. We've got the vulnerability assessment, and we've got the classify data task. So like us, Microsoft have identified the need to add some extra information beyond the column names, and so that we can provide some business context, so that we can help support the business decisions that are being made, the risk assessment that is being performed, so that the organization has a defensible position. So this looks pretty good. It's got some recommendations for me on classifications. I'm going to click in there and see what they look like. And I can see some reasonably sensible recommendations, I think. If I just zoom out again, I can see that an email address has been identified as contact info. It's an email address on the person table, and that has an information type, which might help me to make a decision about what I want to do with this data. And most importantly, I think it has a sensitivity label. Do I need to consider whether this is relevant for particular legislation? So I can accept these one by one, or I can group them, and I can make additions. I can add new classifications. I can, for particular schemas, for particular cases, I can add definitions. So that looks like a good first step, and it certainly will help me to try to make some decisions about how I'm going to protect data. But there's only so much I can do with that information, and it's also database by database. So what we've done at Redgate is take a slightly different approach. Now remember that we're taking a different approach, but I'll explain how it's aligned with the Microsoft approach as well. So remember that we're preparing data for the secondary use. We're going to put it through that provisioning system. We're going to run it. We're going to run masking operations against it. We're going to make adjustments to the database so that it's the right database for the operation that we're going to perform. We're going to do things in shifting left from that production copy, like preparing it for secondary use by replacing personal data with generated data. We may do things like remap permissions. Your permissions will likely be different for each environment. If they're not different for each environment, you might need to consider why they're not different for each environment. That's certainly very clearly in the part of Sarbanes-Oxley and many other sort of control objectives that help people comply with all the main regulations, really, the ISOs and so on. So you probably want to remap your permissions, and for many people, you'll want to replace internal reference data, service endpoints, and lookup tables. So you've got operations that you need to perform in order to stay compliant, in order to maximize the protection that you're applying to production data when you're moving it out of the production environment. So let's have a look at SQL Data Privacy Suite, look at how we take the aligned but slightly different approach with the Redgate tools. Now remember, so our workflow is about preparing data for secondary use. This is a preview feature in SQL Estate Manager. So SQL Estate Manager, is part of our SQL Data Privacy Suite. And you can see here, so the Microsoft approach of going to a database and running the task to classify data was pretty promising, but we think in our context, where we're helping with database DevOps, we need to look at where those databases are. Are they in the production environment? Are they in the non-production environment? And perform operations server by server, SQL instance by SQL instance. So in this case, I'm drilling down onto a particular SQL instance. This is just in the test environment at Redgate. And I'm going to look at that same database, this AdventureWorks 2012, that I was looking at a moment ago. I'm going to click through here and see some classification suggestions. Now, this is looking kind of familiar. The truth is we've implemented the same thing that Microsoft have. We've taken the first step in exactly the same way because we want to ensure that where there are differences, that we have a good path between those differences. We want to make sure that you can work with us to try out the Redgate approach, which emphasizes knowing about environments, which emphasizes the delivery of databases in DevOps scenarios, and allows interoperability with the other Redgate tools. We want to make sure you can go down that path and still be compliant with the Microsoft approach. So let's have a look at these capabilities. I'm going to do what I didn't see through to completion on the SQL Server Management Studio example. I'm going to select all those suggestions, accept all of them, and I'm going to apply them. So if I go back to my view of instances and go back into this, I can see that my AdventureWorks 2012 database is no longer a priority. That has been classified. Let me just double check that indeed was classified. You might have a refresh. This is a preview feature. Did I mention? I think we've got a classification there. Yes, we do. We have classifications there. Just a little refresh issue there. So if we go back to SQL clone, so I was preparing, I was adding information, metadata, for a purpose. I do want to be able to communicate with my business about where the personal data is and how we're controlling it. That will come later, but I can certainly extract some views now from that database that will help me to do that. I can use my interface to show what I've done so far. But in my case, I want to make sure that my image creation, my delivery of copy databases for non-production uses is as secure as it possibly can be. So what I'm going to do, I started off in the dashboard, and I'm going to create a new image. So remember, SQL clone uses a two-step process. You create a DevOps prepared image, a database for subsequent use. And effectively, this is the virtual hard disk. This is using the virtual disk system to create a virtual hard drive that is ready for reuse. And because when it's reused, because the data is virtualized, it takes a very small disk footprint at the time of use. So it gives me the option of creating a new image. I'm going to take it directly from a SQL Server connection. I'm going to select the instance that I was working on earlier, and I'm going to select that AdventureWorks 2012 database where we performed some classifications. And what's happened here is that the context that I've supplied, the business context, has been used, that metadata has been used to inform the provisioning workflow to make sure that I know some operations need to be carried out. This database contains data that has been classified in these two categories and that I ought to apply a masking set. So that's good information. I think I can use that, and I'm going to use that information to apply a masking set. So if I go to my SQL instance, let me just apply the masking set here again. Let me just run through that again. I'm going to create from iClone1 AdventureWorks 2012. I'm warned, and I'm going to, this is where I had my masking sets. I'm going to just drag and drop in some masking sets that I prepared. So here's AdventureWorks basic identity masking. This has been prepared using Datamasker, which is part of the SQL Provision offering. I'll just drag and drop that in there. And I now know that that is going to be applied before that database is made available to anybody else, before a developer can use it, before it can enter any of those other environments. And I also have the ability to add T-SQL scripts. If I already have a masking mechanism, I can add these there as well. In this case, I think I'm going to add some update for logins, because my logins ought to be different between different environments. So now I know I'm going to perform an operation which will involve some masking and swapping out some logins, making it appropriate for the target environment. Just before I kick that off, I'm going to have a look at what it was that I decided to mask and why I decided to mask it. So I'm going to have a look at the using a script that I prepared recently. I'm going to have a look at what the AdventureWorks database contains. So very straightforward query here on the person.email address table and the person.address table. If I execute this, I can see some things here that I'm probably not happy with sharing. This is personal data. It really shouldn't appear, even though it is a corporate email address. That does, if you can trace it back to a natural living person under the language of the GDPR, that is personally identifiable data, and it can't be used beyond its consented boundary. Further down here, I've got some addresses. I've got address data, city data, and postcodes. I'm not really happy with those being in the non-production environment. Most likely, I'd have to go quite a lot further, but those are the examples that I've chosen for now to deal with. So I'm going to start my operation. The only things I need to do now are to create a destination. So I'm going to call this AdventureWorks Mast. And I'm going to create the image. Now, if we remember, I'll just zoom in on this while we're looking at the operation. If you remember, this is the one time the database gets copied. It gets placed into a virtual hard disk that's ready for mounting in a virtualized form. When it gets mounted, it takes very little time. It's running its modifications. It's adjusting that AdventureWorks database so that it's ready for the destination environment. And it's completing that operation, unmounting the disk and making it ready for use. So it now appears in my dashboard. and I can see now that this is not the original, but a modified image of the original database. If I want to create a clone from that, and now I think Steve's going to take you into some of the new features in SQL Clone shortly, which involve templated changes. There's some really exciting new capabilities there. But I'm going to, for the moment, just deliver this copy into the same place that the original came from. And I'm going to call it AdventureWorks Mast for dev. That will do. Creating a clone. Sorry if if you've seen this before, but creating a clone always takes a few seconds. It is a very, it's a very short operation because it's only attaching a pre-existing virtual disk, and I can create as many of them as I like, so that developers get isolated copies. So let's have a look at what effects that had. If we go back into SQL Server Management Studio, I'm going to create a new tab here, so that I can change my target database. I can change my connection. I can use SQL prompts, of course. It's going to pick up on the clone name, which is very handy. And when I perform that same query against this, the AdventureWorks that's been masked for development use, let's execute that. And I can see a different set of email addresses. These email addresses by themselves are no longer identifying. I can see a different set of let me see, that's the original, that's the masked copy, postal code, city, address line, and email address have been changed. So I'm happy with that for the moment. I've applied a change that's in line with the change that my classifications told me should be performed. That's just a first step, of course. There's a lot of other things coming along the way. Not least, we've got some changes to the way that we can create masking sets. So that's pretty exciting. There's breaking news on that, which is that we now have the SQL fig leaf, which is the attempt to bring the Redgate approach, the Redgate ease of use, to a complex and difficult workflow for data masking. So I'll just very briefly show you how we'd go about that. SQL fig leaf allows me to create masking plans, and of course we see a future where we can integrate all these things together so that your data classification set can help you to create a masking plan, so that your provisioning system can check that the masking plan did in fact perform operations on all the columns that were marked as sensitive. So that this becomes a really straightforward operation. And in the words of, we had Scott Ambler came to visit us in Redgate recently, and I think his words were good on the modern approach to governance. The modern approach to agile governance is about making the right thing ridiculously easy. It's not about follow these rules. It's about make the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard. And that's very much the sort of philosophy that we're trying to put in place with the Redgate tools at the moment. So I'm going to open a masking plan. This is just a very early sort of a sneak peek at how we see the future of creating masking sets. In my case, I'm just going to pick that same AdventureWorks database. And we think the actual operation that we're going to perform, you see this is a partially created masking set already. I can see that I've added a random email to be generated for a couple of email address fields. I've added a first name, I've added some constants. I've got some masks already prepared, but when I'm adding a mask, I've got a workflow that I think is much more intuitive than any other masking systems that you might have seen. So we're hopeful that this will really help the data industry to apply masking, to remove some of the burdens, remove some of the barriers. So if I want to look across my whole estate and I want to see all the kind of all the phone numbers that are involved in my database, then I have the ability to very quickly skim across them by name, because I'm probably going to be able to identify an awful lot of the masking that I need to perform, specifically by column names. I can see previews of the data. If I go back here and look at the various address types, I can see that I've got all kinds of address types matching here. And I can start applying In bulk operations, some of the masking operations that I want to be carried out on my masking as part of my masking set and as part of my provisioning. So we're calling this SQL Fig Leaf. It's just gone public beta. So if you'd like to help us to learn more about data masking needs, if you'd like to find out whether an intuitive interface is going to help you to perform masking operations, then please do get in touch with the SQL Fig Leaf team. But right now, Redgate has best of breed provisioning with data masking and with classification that informs the provisioning system, that lets it know whether the original data that is being provisioned has got sensitive data or not. So switching back to my slides, the SQL Data Privacy Suite helps you get started on all these in all these areas. We can help you with discovery. We can scan your network using the SQL Data Privacy Suite for SQL Server instances. We can set up to search multiple Active Directory domains. We can add as your SQL databases. And like Microsoft, we can generate classification suggestions. In our preview feature, you can do that by instance, so that you can see how far you've got in those instances. We're building out the ability to, right now we're persisting in the extended properties in the same way that Microsoft is doing it. Very shortly, we'll be persisting to a central metadata store, a data catalog, if you like, for cases where it's difficult to change the schema, because we know that that's very common for the vendor database scenarios. And we can alert you to changes over time, to the fact that a schema has changed in an environment, to the fact that a schema change is due to enter production and may need to be classified. New instances can be discovered, and we can report on deviations from best practice. We can customize those reports and make them appropriate to your environment, to the risk assessment that you've performed as an organization, in order to be in the most defensible position, in order to be at the level of protection that you've decided is appropriate to your business. Our SQL estate managed for privacy in our vision ensures every database copy has been masked appropriately. It checks on the masking operation and makes sure it's appropriate. It controls sanitized database copies, so you don't get data sprawl, because you're not copying databases ad hoc. You're not copying them project by project. You're certainly not giving too large a number of people the keys to your production environment in order to perform operations. So with managed provisioning, you give a copy fit for the purpose, whether it's analytics or database testing or application testing, and then you revoke it when it's no longer required. In fact, some of our SQL provision customers have what they call Cinderella clones. They revoke them automatically after 7 days or after a certain period of time. I think that's a pretty good approach, where you know that you've got a shelf life of a particular piece of work that should never be more than a few days. We want to build out the capability to make sure that your retention schedules are managed by policy. So you can minimize the storage of personal data, even in backups, while maximizing operational stability. In this new era of oversight, you've got to make a call on some of these things, and our vision of the SQL estate management helps you to protect your business and align them with the call that you've made, with that upfront decision making. So maximized by real-time monitoring to meet recovery time objectives, to meet some of those sometimes overlooked requirements of data protection legislation, such as availability. Non-availability of data is a serious issue, not just for your business's operational needs, but could also be a serious issue for your ability to comply with subject access requests and to comply with data privacy legislation. So in an estate that's fully managed, your protection will be aligned with the place that your data is residing. Hopefully it's fully masked, fully de-identified in cases where the exposure is slightly larger, but also that the features like transparent data encryption and availability groups are switched on if that's your policy in the production environments. So Thanks very much for your attention. There are great resources on the Redgate website. You'll have heard about the Redgate Community Hub, the Redgate Universities, the breaking news that Annabelle announced earlier. There's also a GDPR site, sub-site. And if you are interested in some of the future interfaces for data masking that we're building out, on top, I should say, of our best of breed and very battle-tested core data masking capability, then Project Fig Leaf is available for public beta from today, I believe. So I really hope you enjoy the rest of today. You've got great sessions coming up on other aspects of data protection, and I hope you find them useful and informative. Thanks.